Welcome to Woman. Our topic this evening is men's liberation. Our guest is Warren Farrell, and Warren has written a book called Beyond Masculinity, published by Random House. Warren, the first time I saw you, you were walking on a picket line on Fifth Avenue, carrying a sign saying, "I will not be a success object." Now, I know what a sex object is, but what's a success object?
I guess a success object is sort of what I've been all my life, and like I can remember when we used to get around in high school and start talking about men and and women and going out with women. We used to say, "I went out with this chick last night," and whenever I overheard a woman's conversation, they were saying things like, "I went out with this guy last night, and he's going to be he's going to go to this type of school, or he's going to go to this type of college, or he's going to be a lawyer," and people now are saying, he's going to be a lawyer. So that while we were guilty of treating women as sex objects, in a sense, they were guilty of treating us as success objects. And almost all through, even now, last year when I gave up my position at Rutgers to move down with my wife to Washington.
Wait, let's clarify that.
Oh, all right.
You tell.
All right. Last year, my wife got a White House Fellow, which was a process by itself, which maybe we'll get into later. But I moved down to Washington and left my job at Rutgers, which is where I was teaching, to join her down there for the year. And I found that it was very difficult for me not to be able to describe myself as a professor at Rutgers University, that I was so much into having to have a title and a function as a definition of myself. And I started, at one part of me was saying, well, what's wrong with that? And the other part of me was realizing that I was specializing in urban politics, which is what I was teaching there, and I really was having a much deeper interest personally in sex roles and women's liberation and men's liberation, and I wasn't free to get deeply involved in that area time-wise until I moved down with my wife, and she was sharing that breadwinning role, and that gave me a new look at myself. I could say I could take the whole year out to do writing, to do freelance writing, freelance thinking in a way, do TV and radio shows, finish off the writing of my book, finish off the writing of my dissertation. There were just so many things that I could do when I wasn't tied into having to sort of fulfill my expectations of becoming an assistant professor, an associate professor, a full professor type of thing. And I guess that's what I mean partially by being a success object.
You make it sound easy. I can't imagine the decision to give up your job and go where your wife had to go. Was a simple process. I mean,
well, it wasn't. And in fact, it sort of is complicated for much before the process of having to make the decision. Like, it was one thing to make the decision to give up the job once she had gotten the White House Fellow, but it was started about 8 or 9 months before that, it started about 3 years before that. 3 years ago, she brought home the White House Fellow's application and asked me to apply, because I was the political scientist.
Oh, that's interesting.
And it was only as she changed her own concept of herself, did she think of applying for herself, and did she think the White House Fellow involves working as an assistant to one of the cabinet secretaries, or the president or the vice president. And it was only after she changed her self-concept that she ever thought that she would be capable of doing that. And but then there's about 4 or 5 stages to the competition of selection processes, and each stage you go through an interview. And the interview meant my taking out evenings to sort of play the supportive role, helping her write up additional aspects of her resume, just sitting there asking her questions, sort of reviewing the types of things she would do the next day, which is the role that she always used to play for me in concentrating on my career. Well, that's one of the crucial stages that I found, because if I really wasn't adjusting to moving with her emotionally, I would not have given her that support. And because then you prevent her from getting it. And by preventing her from getting it, you never have to face the problem, because you can always say to yourself, oh, I would have done it. But then after she got it, and I thought it wouldn't be too difficult a decision to make, I found myself going to sherry parties with the spouses who were called the wives of the White House Fellows. And while she was going off meeting with Walt Rostow and Bill Buckley and this type of person, and we were getting into conversations of how to decorate the house and which community we would be moving into, and I just and a lot of these things being introduced 15 times in a row as the husband of the husband of the husband of the husband of, until suddenly you're sort of freaking out at where's what are you doing, what is my identity. So no, it wasn't. It might have even been an easier decision than all the things that preceded it and all the things that came afterwards.
Did you talk about this? I mean, did you talk about being introduced as the husband of kind of thing with her?
Yes, did, but mostly I found through the consciousness raising group, which is sort of a group of about 7 or 8 men. You
do a lot of that, don't you? You travel around the country and start men's consciousness raising groups.
Yes, men's and joint consciousness raising.
And you belong to one yourself?
Mm-hmm, and have for the last 4 years.
Do you want to talk about that? What happens in your consciousness raising group? Is that where you discussed being the husband of?
Yeah, yes, so that was the context in which, like, I found that oftentimes during our daily life we didn't get a chance to sit down and sort of bring to the surface some of the little things that were bothering each other, about things like this, that because we just didn't realize that they were really bothering us and we couldn't pin it down. And when we started talking about what's bothering us in a structured format in the consciousness raising group, then that came out much more easily. And so that was the first time I was able to sort of really verbalize the fact that things like that were bothering me. For example, Ursi was sitting at a table with my advisor who had been my advisor for about 3 or 4 years at NYU, and one of my expertise is American government, and he had just finished an American government textbook, and there was a chapter in the textbook that was on the presidency, and he said, I'd really like you to review this chapter, Ursi. And so things like that were beginning to annoy me, and talking about those in the consciousness raising groups, sometimes just by talking about them you realize how silly it is to worry about them, and then you're not nearly as annoyed. And that was also, I think, one of the things that enabled me to see all the freedom that could come from the year, in terms of not having to worry about getting more deeply involved in urban politics if I really wanted to do something with sex roles. And the group was instrumental in sort of helping me look at different alternatives that I might. We don't solve problems for the other persons in the group, but we do what we call alternative seeking, which is different persons in the group throwing out ideas, and then it's up to me to decide whether I can implement them or not, and whether they apply to my life.
So it's not like other kinds of group therapy at all, is it?
No, it's, I think, quite a bit different in the sense that what we really aim to do is to make people and make ourselves more aware of the ways in which we're limiting ourselves because of the image of what we have to be as a man. And my problem was that I had the image that I had to, at least, I had gotten over the fact that I had to earn more money than my wife, but I still had not gotten over the fact that I didn't have to walk around and walk into a party and say, I'm Warren Farrell, professor at Rutgers. I still needed a title to identify me as a man, because the man's role is to have a position and a title and to be respected, and that's where I get my respect from.
Do you think that's true of most men, that they need the title, they need the masculine image?
I think so. I think as long as we're saying to men that it's a man's role to earn the bread, he's going to identify his title and his salary with his masculinity.
So a thing that people who are concerned with men's liberation are saying is that we must redefine our masculinity, or what we see as our masculinity.
Yes, exactly. This is sort of why I titled the book Beyond Masculinity, sort of, to get beyond that concept of what is presently considered masculinity. It's very interesting. Most people react to that and say, beyond masculinity, you mean homosexuality. And that's the only thing that they can conceive of that could be beyond masculinity. And,
why don't you give us your private definition of what men's liberation means, and go into the masculinity thing a little bit?
Okay, let's see. I think it means being free from having to specialize, being able to be vulnerable, admit weakness, and we can see a great deal of this in the whole political sphere, the difficulties involved with this. Being able to to cry, to be emotional. I really think men are literally emotionally constipated. To be able to not only express independence, but also to be able to express dependence on people and institutions and other things. Being able to ask a question to which we do not already know the answer without working in our title, our background, and a statement of what we know about the fact already.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are some of the things. It's just, it has a lot of other ramifications, but just within those few things alone.
Do you think that the men's liberation movement would be in existence at this point if it weren't for the feminist movement?
No.
You don't?
No.
I think that's interesting. Do you feel that they're in any way in competition? I mean,
I think that there may be a handful of persons who perceive them as being in competition, but I think that it's exactly the opposite is true, that they're in... I have received letters from so many women who have said something to the effect that I have 2 or 3 children, I haven't finished college yet, I started with the children when my husband was going to, to school, I've sort of lost my total identity, I've got to make a decision now between whether I'm going to give up my husband or I'm going to give up my identity. And because once she goes to consciousness raising groups and once she starts getting aware of her own self-concept, then she has to make, and if the man is not involved in also growing and liberating himself at the same time, and he doesn't see any of the freedoms that come from that,
mm-hmm.
and that is one of the, if I had to name another thing that masculinity is all about, it's about getting over that, it's about learning to introspect and learning to listen and learning to respect women enough to be able to learn from women. And all 3 of those things are very difficult for men to do. And it's only when men are able to do those things that the man can start growing and getting involved and rethinking what his role is. And it's at that point that she doesn't have to make the choice between her own identity and the and women's and staying with her husband, and therefore not having her children be without parents, and not having to worry about going out in the job market without an education and this type of thing. And a lot of women are dropping out of the movement who are weaker women or who have so many confines of poverty, of not being involved with a very unsupportive husband, because they have to make that choice. And I think that when that choice does not have to be made, that the women's liberation movement as well as the men's liberation movement will be much stronger.
Do you find that couples are successfully going through consciousness raising together, or do you think it has to be a separate thing?
I'm sorry, I missed your question because I self-listened. It was just that I was sitting here amazed at the fact that whenever I have an interview I very seldom have an interview with a man who lets me go on for more than a few sentences to explain the question that he asked me. And it's very interesting that I can sit here and feel free to give the full explanation to something without feeling pressured to cut myself off. And that, so...
Okay, I'll repeat the question. Do you think that it's possible for married couples to go through consciousness raising together in the same group, or do you think it's something that has to happen separately? I know
right.
you do some of that.
Right. I think that there's a real value to the separate women's and men's groups. The separate women's groups helping women get support for each other, the separate men's groups helping men also see support for each other, getting some of the prejudices out on the table that they would not do in front of women, talking about some of the topics in the cruder forms that, because we haven't thought it through nearly as much as women have at this stage in history. All these things I think are valuable for men to get together separately for. But what we've been finding is that after men get together for a couple of months, because there's no sort of background of men's liberation to work from, they don't really know what to talk about. And
what do they talk about?
Well, they talk about things like what type of sexual relationships I have with a woman, how I can make those sexual relationships more liberated. And in fact, we found after the 3rd or 4th week that was all we had talked about when we first started meeting. and realized that there was something funny about that. And when we thought about it, we realized that our whole discussions of women were as sexual discussions. And they weren't about their careers, our careers. They weren't about specializing. They weren't about the human values that women brought into our lives. They weren't about any other dimensions of women but the sexual dimensions. So that while we were talking about that in a so-called liberated fashion, it was really unliberated, because that was our concept of what a woman was to us, and we were just changing that aspect of the concept. And it was
So
really
what happened after you realized this? Did you then talk about housework?
Well, back to the separate things for a minute. We realized that we were sometimes, we discovered it first by, men were talking about, I had this relationship with my wife who, and then they were building up this image of what the wife was like. And then we would meet the woman friend or the wife or the man that was talking and find that she didn't fulfill that image at all, and that he had built up this, what we call a straw woman. And we found often that the women's groups were doing the same thing about us. And that it was really valuable to get the two groups together after a period of time being separate, to bring these discussions into reality. And then a lot of times, like, the man would be saying, oh, I really have looked all over the world for a liberated woman, but I can't find one, because even when the woman drives, I asked the woman if she wanted to drive, and she doesn't want to drive, and this type of thing, and the woman says, well, I don't even have my keys to drive, and I've always got to ask you for it, so I just let you go ahead and drive. And there's just a lot of little things and very big things that get clarified when the groups are together. But then if the groups get exclusively together, then we find that then the male starts dominating the female again. All the role playing continues. The woman, instead of making a statement, sort of says, oh honey, do you think that? And sort of goes back to her soft listening, drawing, forcing him to be a problem solver approach. And it's only when she has a chance to go back to the other woman that the woman can say, I think that you may have been doing this, and that's something that you wanted to get out of. Can we help? Can we work with you on getting out of that? Instead of the man saying, see, you're doing that all over again. And so that gives her a feeling of women and sisters being a help to her, as well as men always being her teacher.
Are men threatened by their wives becoming feminists or becoming liberated, or whatever term you'd like to use? Do they then come to you and say, what do I do now? She's joined the feminist movement. How do I respond?
Yes. The answer to the question has to be, yes, men are threatened. On the other hand, I think there's so much incredibly great basis for men not only not being threatened, but being threatened by the unliberated woman, who I think is really very threatening to men. Who is the man?
What's an unliberated woman? Give us a definition so we can...
A woman who wants the man to earn all the bread, who sees herself as the only person that can take care of the children, really, even though the husband might take them to the zoo on the weekends, who is afraid to step out into the world on her own, and therefore if there's a breach between she and her husband, is going to be very much likely just to cling on to him because he's the financial security. So in a sense, she's a prostitute and he's, the person keeping the prostitute, and there's no way out for either one of them. And I think that there are many marriages that that find themselves growing apart for natural reasons, because the division of labor, the man working outside of the home, the woman working inside of the home, almost invariably leads to a division of interests. And then the woman says, after a couple of years, I think there's something unfulfilled in my life. I better do something that will fulfill me. I better have a child. And then that gap is not dealt with, because the child becomes the center of attention in that gap. And so we see the divorce rate rise drastically after 25 years when the children go away to college or get married. Then suddenly the parents have to look back at themselves again and find that there was never anything there, or there was something there 20 years ago, but there's nothing there now. And despite all the social sanctions that are still on divorce, they end up getting divorced. And so that I think that the woman who's deeply involved in hanging on to a man because she has no alternative is basically taking 20 years out of a man's life, because she needs the financial income that he's bringing in, and that's part of what I also mean by being a success object.
So you think men are much more threatened by that kind of woman than a woman who's liberated?
They should be more threatened by
They
that
should
type of
be,
woman.
but
If we
are
weren't, no, not now, because we just haven't even ever looked at women in that light. We've really been victims of our socialization, just like women have, and I think it's often been much more many men recognized what it was for a woman to be involved in women's liberation before the woman recognized it. And I think we're going to expect just the opposite, many women discovering what it's involved to be in men's liberation before men recognize it, because women can look at men's role in perspective. We've been taught to live that role our entire lives.
Do other men put you down because of what you're doing?
Not to my face. I guess, let's see, I think I can tell more through the suppressed smiles than when a man is looking at you and sort of, looks back like that, and sort of, a smile breaks over his face when he finds out what you're doing. And I get some of that, but I get a tremendous amount more positive feedback than I ever expected. And I think part of that is because there's a lot of men who would like to be doing something. Most men are intelligent enough to have a lot of different ideas run through their life about what they would like to be doing, and they're hooked into a job, being producer or cameraman, what have you, and they would like to be maybe a producer instead of a cameraman, or like to just get into a different field, traveling, selling real estate, or teaching or something like that. And I think there's a certain amount of respect, I think, that has often come from the man that says, gee, I'd like to be breaking away and trying some other things as well. And I see what you're saying can lead to that. But there's a lot of difference between that intellectual recognition and then going through all the processes of interacting with a woman so that's possible for him.
You think they question your masculinity? Their definition of masculinity?
Yeah, I think there's occasionally that. Like I get sometimes men asking me questions like, did you ever play any sports when you were younger? And then when I said, when I say what sports I've played, they sort of go, oh, as if that was sort of one thing taken away. I used to find myself responding, oh yes, I almost got a scholarship for football, in college, and then I realized that that was my insecurity popping up and saying yes, this type of thing. And how many years have you been married? Or are you married?
Do you have children?
Yes, do you have children? Yeah, that type of thing.
What brought you to the picket line? I mean, you didn't just appear there.
Yeah, wow.
And was it a long process? Is it something, that you felt as a young man, or?
I don't think so. Yes and no. There were some things I think I saw a little bit more graphically than perhaps most men do. Now, let me preface this by saying that I'm telling you the things that I'm aware of. I'm sure that there are things psychologically that I'm not aware of. One of the things I can remember was my mother getting a part-time job and being much, much happier when she had the part-time job, and my father reacting, well, okay, I see you're happier, but still make sure you take care of all the the housework. And I can remember him sort of bugging her more and more, to take care of more of the work on that. And then I found that as she stopped her part-time jobs, which she took with a temporary agency, she found that she went back into sort of being somewhat depressed. And then when she went back into the job, she got out of her depression. And I saw this back and forth for about a period of 4 or 5 years. And I think that painted a graphic picture that it was hard for any of us to escape in terms of that type of appreciation for some aspect of women's liberation. For some reason that I don't know, I always had a very deep interest in intelligent women who were active and had their own interests. I don't know what the psychological rationale behind that is.
Was it your wife's liberation that really started you?
No. For most men it is, but I got involved in it much before she did.
Oh, that's interesting. Did you then relate to her what you were experiencing and what you were learning?
Yes, I did. And then she found, she didn't find any difficulty getting involved in it. Well, actually we did at first. We talked, one of the decisions for me was to decide whether or not to break away from my urban politics area and do my dissertation on the area of women's and men's liberation. And we both decided no, we wouldn't do that because we had a nice marriage the way it was, and we didn't want to threaten it by getting involved in women's liberation. Because she was typing my papers, and I was, I was involved in for a while in being prepared to be an advisor, assistant to an advisor to the president, and that looked like I was going to, and I was having all sorts of materials being given to me. So it meant a PhD at 24 years of age with $10,000 worth of scholarship help and the staff help that I needed and access to documents, and that sort of, that success, all the male bribes, in a sense, were there for me, and this meant a threat to all of them. Plus the fact that if I did my dissertation on women's and men's liberation and I'm a political scientist, who the heck is going to respect that and who's going to hire me for that?
Right.
So there was just all these things that laid down on us, and so we both decided that I wouldn't get involved in it. And it was only after it kept coming back to me as an interest and I kept wanting to be involved in it that I decided, wait, what is life all about? And then we started talking that out. And that's when I got some of my insights into it's not just women that are oppressed, but here I'm giving into this, this prestige thing, the money thing, and what I call the clockwork executive syndrome. I had this timetable that I had to meet. It wasn't good enough that I get a PhD. I had to do it when I was younger than anyone else around me, so that I could prove to everyone else that I was not only a PhD, but I was a brilliant PhD. And it's sick, when you look at it logically, but it's so much a part of the syndrome.
You feel that the success thing is the most important thing? Do you?
I think that's the most important general thing, but what it leads to, just like the sex thing for women leads to a lot of other things, what it leads to for men is specializing.
Warren, I'm sorry.
Fine. Okay.
Time is up.
Right.
It's been very enjoyable. Thank you, and good night for women. See you next week.